You can't go through here. It's restricted.
My son, he's hurt. He needs help now.
I said, step back, please.
Step back? Look at him. He's barely breathing.
Just doing my job. You'll have to wait.
Waiting kills him. Rules are more important than his life.
The security camera timestamp reads 2:17 a.m. The hospital lobby smells like antiseptic and rain-soaked concrete. A mother pushes a wheelchair toward the emergency doors. Her son folded inward, blood darkening his shirt. She stopped before the automatic doors can open. A uniformed guard lifts a hand, not in anger, in policy. Minutes stretch. Procedures are followed. And somewhere between protocol and prejudice, a life slips away into if stories like this matter. To you, stories where policy meets power, and silence becomes consequence. Stay with me. Watch closely. What unfolds isn't just one night in one hospital. It's a system revealing itself, frame by frame. Rain-slicked streets reflected the neon hospital sign, fractured into trembling shards with every passing car. The clock above the automatic doors glowed 2:17 a.m., casting an almost clinical light over the empty pavement. Inside, the lobby smelled of antiseptic, of wet concrete, and some faintly metallic blood, perhaps, or the faint memory of it. Every surface gleamed under the harsh fluorescent bulbs, and the silence seemed to absorb sound like a sponge. She appeared first, as movement a figure hunched over a wheelchair, hands clenching the rubber grip so hard her knuckles whitened. Her breath came in sharp, uneven bursts, fogging the glass as she pressed forward, eyes darting from one shadowed corner to the other. Her son was curled in the seat, his body fragile and stiff, chest rising in short, shallow gasps. She had called ahead, twice. The triage nurse's voice, distant over the phone, still echoed in her ears. We're preparing a room. Someone will meet you. Now she ran against minutes that refused to bend. The guard appeared as if materializing from the periphery, straight, backed, uniform crisp, posture rigid, trained, rehearsed, immovable. He didn't speak at first, he merely observed. The automatic doors had a timer, a sensor designed to detect motion, to open, to welcome, to protect. His hand hovered not in anger, not yet, but in authority. Rules were etched in his muscle memory. After 11 p.m. No outside entrance. Security clearance required. EMT only access. All else, wait. She approached, voice taut, trembling yet firm. Please, my son, he needs help. He's not stable. The guard's reply was clipped, precise. You need to wait. No. He can't wait, she stammered. Her gaze flicked to the surveillance cameras embedded in the ceiling, imagining a recording somewhere of every heartbeat, every second wasted. He shifted weight but did not step aside. His eyes scanned her, then the wheelchair, then the doors. There was no malice in his face, only the pale reflection of order enforced without discretion. I'm following protocol, he said, voice calm, like reciting a law learned in training. Chapter 3, Section 4. Emergency access outside EMT hours requires approval from a supervisor. She shook her head, words catching in her throat. Her hands patted the sides of the wheelchair, steadying him, steadying herself. He's bleeding. He's going to die if... The guard raised a finger, interrupting before she could finish. Supervisor approval, he said, tapping the radio clipped to his shoulder. A soft static hissed, followed by a voice. Unit 4, what's your status? She leaned forward, desperate, almost collapsing into the wheelchair. You have to let me in, ma'am, the guard said. And this time there was a hint of frustration beneath the polish of his calm. Rules are rules. I don't make them. Minutes stretched, elastic and unyielding. Outside, the rain hit the pavement in relentless rhythm, each drop a small hammer against her nerves. Inside, the clock ticked with unfeeling precision. She counted each second in her head, imagining them passing over the fragile body of her son. Each moment was a barrier, invisible but concrete, made of authority and policy, of hierarchy and liability, of rules meant to preserve life but applied without humanity. She saw the emergency exit to the side, a door marked authorized personnel only, the red letters reflecting on the wet floor. Her hands flexed in frustration. Please, someone, anyone. The guard's eyes flicked to her, then to the radio. Supervisor, I need clearance for wheelchair entry. Outside of EMT schedule. The pause that followed was heavy, a beat in which she imagined the door finally giving way, imagined her son breathing, imagined relief folding over her like a warm blanket. Unit 4, stand by, the voice crackled back. Confirm patient status, repeat. Her pulse raced. Her son's small body shivered in the cold. She pressed her forehead to his shoulder, feeling the heat of his skin, feeling the fetal rhythm of life under her palm. He's alive. He's alive, she whispered, as much to convince herself as him. The guard exhaled slowly, one hand on the radio, one hand still raised in the unyielding gesture of authority. In this quiet, dimly lit lobby, he was not a villain. He was a fixture of order, a trained professional acting within the narrow bounds of his authority. But the authority was suffocating. The rules were paper walls, invisible yet impenetrable, crushing urgency beneath their weight. She could see him hesitate, the slightest tremor in his posture. A man conditioned to enforce without question, suddenly confronted with a moral weight he had no training to measure. What is protocol when life is bleeding out before your eyes? The static on the radio hummed louder in her ears than the rain outside. Then, a voice gravelly, commanding pierced through. Unit 4, authorize entry. Immediate. The guard froze. The simple instruction was both liberation and judgment. His hand twitched, caught between obedience to protocol and recognition of consequence. The camera above recorded every inch of his hesitation, every heartbeat of indecision. A decision that would feel small in the moment, almost administrative. Yet it carried weight beyond policy, beyond the walls of the hospital, beyond the clock that ticked against the rhythm of a child's fragile life. She felt it, instinctively. The hinge on which all of this teetered. She leaned forward, whispering to her son, almost there. Her eyes never left the guard, reading the subtle shifts of authority, the brief human cracks behind the uniformed facade. Outside, the rain slowed, but the lobby remained oppressive, a frozen tableau of human urgency against institutional inertia. She knew what was coming. She feared it, yet held a fragile thread of hope. The guard's hand finally moved toward the door, toward duty, toward consequence. And in that instant, before the doors could yield, before the system could either fail or bend, the lobby seemed to hold its breath, suspended in the delicate balance between life, rules, and the human heart pressing against them. The rain had stopped, leaving the street glistening like black glass, reflecting the hospital's neon glow in fractured shards. Inside, the lobby had become a stage of frozen motion. Time no longer measured itself. In seconds it stretched, rubbery and unyielding, bending around each heartbeat, each shallow breath, each hesitation. Somewhere, a clock ticked mechanically, oblivious to human urgency. Surveillance cameras hummed quietly from above, recording every movement, every detail. Yet nothing on the other side of the screen seemed to matter. Each second was catalogued in logs, entry timestamps, security reports, triage sheets, paperwork already in motion before a life had truly reached its climax. The mother shifted on the spot, hands gripping the wheelchair. Her son slumped slightly, his small body trembling in rhythm with her shallow, anxious breaths. She tried to catch the attention of passing staff nurses and orderlies who moved through the brightly lit corridors with quiet purpose. Their eyes flicked at her, but they followed triage codes. Trauma protocols dictated priorities. Someone with high vital signs, unstable airway, or visible hemorrhage would get immediate attention. But here, the child's fragility was folded into the outside entry problem, a gray zone that the system hadn't accounted for. She leaned toward the guard, voice tight. Please. My son, he's losing too much blood. I need someone to help him. He shifted slightly, foot tapping in a rhythmic beat against the polished floor. His eyes scanned her. Then the wheelchair, then the doors. Behind the calm, a calculus was running: training, fear, hierarchy, liability. Each decision was mediated by policy manuals that never spoke to the human heart. Where should he stand to maintain security? When should he call for backup? How long could he enforce rules without exceeding the limit of civil liability? Every movement was precise, rehearsed. A choreography designed to prevent chaos, not tragedy. I'm calling it in again, he said into the radio, voice clipped. The static hissed, the supervisor's response slow, delayed. Stand by, confirm patient status. The mother's chest tightened. Each pause felt like an eternity. She rocked the wheelchair slightly, whispering reassurances to her son that she knew were fragile lies, almost there, almost. Her words collided with the antiseptic chill of the lobby, leaving her empty, shaking. Inside the hospital, nurses moved through fluorescent corridors with brisk efficiency. They followed triage priorities, their eyes trained on vital signs and treatment protocols. One nurse glanced toward the lobby, registering the mother's presence. Check the screen. Outside, non-emergency entry unit 4 handling. Hands resumed charting, the calm precision of trained professionals, masking the tension that hung in the air like mist. Back at the doors, the mother tried another tact, softer, pleading, human. He's only 8. Please, you don't understand, he can't wait. He can't. The guard exhaled slowly. His voice was measured. I understand. But rules are rules. I don't make them. Her hands flexed on the wheelchair handles, trembling. She leaned closer. If you cared about rules more than him, he'd already be dead. For a moment, silence stretched between them. It was not the silence of calm, it was the silence of inertia. The kind that fills a room and allows tragedy to happen quietly. No one shouted. Tempers didn't flare. Coolness prevailed. And that coolness, that clinical calm, was what made harm possible. Static crackled again from the radio. Unit 4, what is status? Repeat. He tapped a finger on the receiver, thinking. Patient unstable. Bleeding. Outside entrance request. Copy. Stand by for supervisor authorization, came the delayed reply. The mother's eyes flicked toward the clock. 2:35 a.m. Her pulse thrummed violently in her ears. She could feel the weight of each passing second folding over her shoulders like wet blankets. Her son's small frame shivered, head tilting against the chair. She pressed a hand to his forehead, warm, clammy. Minutes became hours. Or perhaps nothing at all. The lobby held them in suspended animation, the walls echoing the soft tapping of shoes on tile. Every second documented somewhere on surveillance, in logs, in reports, yet the essential movement, the human motion that could save a life, was trapped behind uniformed authority and protocol. She tried once more, negotiating through tone and posture, trying to make her urgency legible. He's weak. He's barely conscious. You have to. The guard shook his head, voice calm, procedural. I need supervisor clearance. That's the protocol. He glanced down the corridor. Footsteps passed by, muted and mechanical. He imagined calling for backup security contractors or additional hospital staff, but hesitated. Each intervention could trigger a complaint, a liability review, a lawsuit. His mind tabulated risk and reward as he stood like a sentinel caught in the precise balance between enforcement and human consequence. The mother pressed closer to the wheelchair. Please, she said again, a whisper, a tremor, an imploring prayer. Then, faint but unmistakable, a distant sound, the siren of an approaching ambulance. Her pulse leapt, hope rising, but the wheels were still too far away, and the seconds had stolen momentum. She clutched the handles tighter, leaning over him. Hold on. Please hold on. The doors finally hissed, as someone opened them inside the hospital. An EMT team entered, moving quickly, checking wristbands, scanning monitors, assessing vitals. But the child was already limp, small features slack. One of the EMTs whispered the technical term as they assessed him. Non-responsive. The word landed softly, almost bureaucratically, like a footnote in a report, yet heavy with finality. The mother's cry caught in her throat. It was neither scream nor sob, just a sharp intake of air. A hollow sound that seemed to echo against the tiled walls. The guard stood frozen, radio in hand, eyes shifting from mother to wheelchair to doorway. His training had not prepared him for this, the collision of rules and consequence. His calm, procedural enforcement had achieved exactly what it was designed to prevent: adherence to policy over life. The lobby, once humming with invisible motion, felt hollow. Surveillance cameras continued to record. Logs would document the sequence of events, times, codes, entries, permissions granted or denied. Yet they could not record urgency, fear, the desperate human calculus played out in real time. She knelt beside the wheelchair, pressing her hands against his chest, counting, hoping someone, anyone. Time stretched again. Outside, the first light of dawn began to smear across wet streets. Inside, fluorescent bulbs flickered overhead. Authority and compliance had frozen reality, and only the weight of consequence remained. Minutes that didn't move had become an eternity. Each second a measure of helplessness, of policies applied without discretion, of quiet tragedy. Somewhere in the shadows, responsibility waited to be claimed or denied. Morning light filtered weakly through the blinds, slicing thin stripes across the hospital's administrative wing. The antiseptic smell lingered, faintly sharpened by the faint aroma of coffee brewing somewhere down the hall. The lobby, once a stage of frozen movement, now hummed with another kind of motion, quiet, mechanical, and deliberate. Paper shuffled, pens scratched across forms, keyboards clattered with soft clicks. Time was no longer elastic. It had crystallized into reports, incident, numbers, and statements typed in precise, unfeeling language. In the center of it all, she sat on a plastic chair, small and still. The wheelchair had been moved to a corner, empty now, a silent witness. Her son's absence weighed on her in a physical way, shoulders hunched, eyes flicking toward the closed doors, as if they might reverse themselves. Policy dictated the order of grief, first statements, then documentation, then an investigator's interview. There was no room for emotion, only procedure. The guard sat across the room, posture taut, uniform immaculate. His statement was concise, clinical, and memorized. I followed protocol. Supervisor was contacted. Entry denied pending approval. Patient non-responsive upon EMT arrival. No deviations from policy. Every word was precise, devoid of inflection, devoid of remorse. It read as if printed directly from the training manual, a perfect exercise in compliance. The mother said nothing. She could not. Words felt inadequate to contain the weight of what had occurred. She shifted in her seat, small movements that made the polished tile floor squeak under her shoes. Her hands were folded tightly, knuckles pale, as if gripping them could anchor the reality she could not yet absorb. Investigators moved methodically, questioning, noting, referencing standards of care. One cited hospital protocols on security scope, emphasizing the hierarchy between security contractors and hospital administration. Another mentioned federal and state civil rights statutes quietly, underlining the boundary between medical delay and medical denial. Every reference was precise, factual, methodical. In their hands, the tragedy became a case study, dissected through layers of law and policy. The room was a hive of quiet efficiency, yet beneath the surface, contradictions began to surface. Timestamps didn't align. The supervisor's call had been logged at 2:20 a.m., yet secure footage showed hesitation and delay that extended beyond that moment. Forms indicated rapid communication. But the mother remembered seconds, stretching endlessly, her son slipping further into unresponsiveness. These contradictions hovered like shadows, subtle but persistent, as if the system itself blinked and faltered under scrutiny. A junior compliance officer, tasked with reviewing video evidence, paused the tape. The camera angle captured the mother's hands as she rocked the wheelchair slightly, pressing her forehead to her son's shoulder. The motion was small, almost imperceptible, yet it conveyed the full weight of human urgency and helplessness. The officer leaned closer, momentarily frozen, witnessing vulnerability intersect with bureaucratic rigidity. It was the only time in the morning that someone inside the machine of administration truly saw what had happened. Paperwork continued around them. Incident reports failed in passive voice, each sentence designed to dull the edges of responsibility. Patient encountered delay. Security protocol followed. Supervisor contacted. Words arranged carefully, excused what had gone unspoken, what had been silently endured. Accountability diffused across departments, leaving only the residue of consequence for those left outside the lines of procedure. The mother's silence became a statement in itself. Every passing minute was an argument that grief, unpolished by policy, was impossible to document. When investigators glanced at her, their questions paused midair, reframed by the raw, silent narrative she embodied. No law or protocol could capture it fully. The guard shifted in his chair, occasionally glancing toward the mother, but never meeting her gaze fully. He was caught in the duality of duty and consequence, trained to see procedure as justice, yet now, confronted with a human verdict, he could not anticipate. His calm professionalism became a barrier between intention and outcome. A wall erected in the name of compliance. Conversations fractured under the weight of stress. Voices, low and measured, overlapped briefly. Administrators debating phrasing in reports, security managers clarifying the extent of authorization, legal counsel noting potential liability. Each utterance was controlled, lacking the heat of confrontation. Tempers did not flare, they cooled methodically. The very calm that prevented chaos in ordinary circumstances now amplified the harm done, a quiet conspiracy of precision. One investigator referenced the hospital's after-hours access manual. Security is only authorized to permit entry with supervisor approval for non-EMT personnel, he said, scanning his notes. Liability arises if protocol is breached, even in emergencies. The guard acted within his scope. Words, factual and detached, floated over the room. They were correct but incomplete. They accounted for procedure, not consequence, protocol, not mortality. The mother's gaze drifted to the clock. 7:02 a.m. The world outside the hospital was waking, oblivious to the hours that had stretched and broken inside. She pressed a hand to her chest, feeling the hollowness where urgency had once surged. Her eyes were drawn again to the video screen as the tape rewound, replaying the faint tremor of her son in the wheelchair, her hands clutching his shoulders. The junior compliance officer, having paused the footage, muttered under his breath, "God," she her hands. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Even in a room of words, forms, and logs, the human truth of helplessness was undeniable. The room smelled faintly of paper and coffee, antiseptic and faint despair. The tension shifted subtly, imperceptibly, as if the machinery of administration was aware of its own limitation. Policy could quantify procedure. Law could parse liability, but none could fully encompass the immediacy of human urgency pressed against indifference by structure. Outside, the city awoke. Traffic buzzed along slick streets, streetlights flickering with morning fatigue. Somewhere, a nurse took a sip of lukewarm coffee, unaware that her protocols had intersected with life and death. Somewhere else, the hospital's front doors gleamed under the weak sun, silent witnesses to the moments that had already passed. Inside, the mother remained still, seated in her plastic chair. Her silence resonated more than any statement she could give. The guard sat across from her, posture tense yet rigid, a man trained to obey and report, now confronted by a truth he could not annotate. And somewhere in the machinery, the logs, the timestamps, the reports, the system blinked, faintly acknowledging the ineffable human fragility, urgency, and the stark weight of consequence that policy alone could never prevent. The day would continue. Reports would circulate, investigators would draft memos, lawyers would debate liability, and administrators would plan press statements. But the raw, unrecorded human reality, the mother's trembling hands, the silent weight of a life lost in procedural delay would linger, unquantifiable, echoing beyond the sterile confines of office walls. By mid-morning, the hospital had shifted from a stage of silent bureaucracy to a quiet storm of public scrutiny. The fluorescent calm of the administrative offices now felt brittle, fragile, as if the walls themselves had grown aware of the story's reach beyond their bounds. Public records requests had begun to arrive: letters, emails, formal inquiries from lawyers, journalists, even state oversight boards. Each request peeled back layers of policy, procedure, and internal documentation, exposing the moments where human urgency had collided with institutional rigidity. A local reporter first noticed the gap. She had requested the incident logs under the state's Open Records Act, scanning timestamps against security footage. Something didn't align. A delay that the official statements could not reconcile with the video evidence. She saw it: the subtle pause, the hesitation, the human calculus behind uniformed authority that hadn't accounted for urgency. It wasn't just a procedural failure. It was a moral one. By noon, the story had begun to escape the building. Social media murmurs grew louder, reshaping the narrative before official channels could intervene. Community meetings formed small groups at first. Neighbors and parents gathered around folding chairs in the high school gymnasium, voices low but charged. The restraint was deliberate, a controlled fury, but fury nonetheless. They shared what they knew, filling in blanks with empathy, outrage, and disbelief. The hospital's polished exterior of authority was cracking. Hospital leadership, sensing exposure, drafted a statement, carefully worded, measured, each phrase vetted for legal precision. "We are deeply saddened by the outcome of the incident." Hospital policies were followed. "We are reviewing procedures to ensure continued patient safety." The words were correct but hollow. They acknowledged the incident without owning its human cost. Lawyers parsed each line, weighing negligence against discrimination, scrutinizing federal civil rights statutes and state healthcare regulation. Every word, every semicolon, became a battleground for accountability. The guard was placed on administrative leave, not fired, not yet. He sat at home in uniform, still crisp from the night before, the weight of procedural obedience pressing against personal responsibility. He replayed each moment, each decision, each word. Supervisor called, protocol followed, patient non-responsive, no deviation. The repetition offered no solace. He was caught between the machine of institutional shielding and the singularity of moral consequence. His conscience now a quiet, persistent judge. Within conference rooms, attorneys' questions sharpened dialogue to a fine edge. Administrators deflected, citing liability, policy, scope of authority. "Our security personnel acted in accordance with approved protocols," one said. "All steps were logged. All approvals were sought." The words, precise and clipped, were met with the mother's quiet interjection, "He was dying, and you watched." The sentence hung in the air, more potent than any barrage of procedural defense. It cut through memoranda, policies, and deflections. It was a moral incision that no training could patch. Reporters began connecting threads, identifying the hospital's previous encounters with regulatory oversight, comparing intake protocols, documenting delays in patient access. The narrative grew from isolated incident to pattern, each revelation amplified by local outrage. Editorial boards questioned whether training manuals and liability concerns were being allowed to outweigh the urgency of care. Every fact, every timestamp, every policy reference became ammunition in the fight between human ethics and institutional protection. Civil attorneys drafted complaints, each paragraph citing policy failure, gaps in procedural response, and lapses in duty. Names were named: the guard, the supervisor, the hospital administration. The complaint didn't seek poetic justice. It demanded systemic accountability, revision of after-hours protocols, mandatory anti-bias training, independent oversight of emergency access, and reparation. The language was meticulous, legal, and exacting, yet beneath it pulsed the emotional truth that bureaucracy had struggled to contain. Human fragility had collided with rigid enforcement, and a life had been lost. Community forums swelled with attendance. Parents, neighbors, and advocates spoke in measured tones, articulating outrage that was disciplined but deeply felt. "If we let this stand," one teacher said, "we are teaching children that procedure matters more than life." The mother attended one session, seated at the edge of a folding chair, hand folded, her expression unreadable but for the trembling in her fingers. Every comment, every question, every assertion of protocol versus humanity landed against her quiet presence, amplifying its significance. The hospital's legal team attempted damage control, careful statements, private briefings, meetings with key stakeholders. "We're reviewing the incident fully," one senior administrator repeated, each word measured to mitigate liability. Behind the closed doors, they debated semantics, delay versus denial, compliance versus human discretion. Every choice was deliberate, intended to shield the institution. Yet the public narrative had already shifted, fueled by witness accounts, video documentation, and the piercing simplicity of a mother's testimony. Inside the lobby, now stripped of its early night tension, the echoes of the tragedy lingered. Chairs sat empty where the mother had once pressed her son to her chest. The wheelchair was gone, relocated to storage, sanitized, a relic of procedural tragedy. Cameras still recorded, but the footage was no longer just a record, it was evidence, a chronicle of bureaucratic inertia and human urgency colliding. The chapter crescendos with the filing of the civil complaint. Lawyers submitted evidence, official logs, incident reports, video documentation, witness statements, and timestamps that highlighted discrepancies. Every detail reinforced the narrative of systemic failure, connecting policy gaps with human cost. Legal language interwove with moral consequence, blending the clinical precision of statute with the raw immediacy of loss. Consequence began to take shape, not merely symbolic, not merely emotional, but structural, procedural, and enforceable. The guard's leave became a symbol, simultaneously protective and punitive. Hospital leadership faced scrutiny they could not redirect. Media attention pressed on all sides, demanding transparency, demanding change. The mother, quiet but resolute, was the nucleus around which this exposure coalesced. Her statements so simple, so cutting, remained suspended in the collective conscience. He was dying, and you watched. The system had been forced to blink, to register that human oversight is never neutral, that policy can shield, but it cannot absolve, that procedure can guide, but it cannot replace judgment. In the haze of exposure, the first hints of reform began to form. Not yet enacted, not yet guaranteed, but beginning. A ripple in the bureaucratic surface, a recognition that consequence, once humanized, cannot be ignored. As the day ended, the hospital remained standing, polished and bureaucratic, yet it had been altered. Words, reports, complaints, and public pressure had begun to reshape its internal landscape. The silence was no longer procedural, it was uneasy, anticipatory. Somewhere, within the administrative walls, decisions were being reconsidered, oversight being recalibrated, policies being rewritten. Outside, the community watched, restrained fury tempered with hope, waiting for a system to respond, not just with words, but with action. The lobby was quiet in a different way now, not tense, not frozen in tragedy, but still. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, their rhythm no longer oppressive, but neutral, almost observant. The rain had returned overnight, leaving the streets outside slick, reflective once again, mirroring the hospital sign and fractured neon. Inside, the polished floors bore no trace of the chaos that had unfolded weeks before. No wheelchairs, no hurried footsteps, no cries. Only the silence remained, altered, aware, and somehow heavier for all it had witnessed. Resolution came quietly, not in headlines or parades, not in the triumphant shouts of justice, but in formal, deliberate procedure. A settlement was reached, $1 million, disbursed with carefully documented acknowledgement of loss. The language in the agreement was precise, legalistic, yet beneath it pulsed the truth of human consequence. Life cannot be fully restored, only accounted for. Alongside the monetary settlement came mandated reforms. After hours, intake protocols were rewritten. Doors that had once remained closed without supervisor clearance now opened automatically past midnight. Anti-bias training for security personnel was instituted, not as a suggestion but with enforceable oversight. An independent review board was established, charged with auditing compliance and evaluating gaps between policy and practice. The guard lost his position. His crisp uniform was replaced by civilian attire, his badge returned, his access revoked. He moved through the city like a man unmoored, realizing too late that the rules he had followed could not shield him from consequence. He had been trained to enforce, to obey, to document, but he had never been trained to interpret urgency, to measure human frailty, to reconcile moral responsibility with procedural certainty. He understood, now, that procedure can enforce order but cannot replace judgment. He would navigate days that felt suspended, moments replaying in his mind with a clarity he could not escape. The radio static, the hesitation, the brief tilt of the mother's head toward her son, each fragment was indelible. Compliance had been exact, yes, correct, but human harm had occurred anyway, and in the absence of malice, in the precision of rule following, he had learned the sharpest lesson of all. Morality cannot always be codified, and adherence alone is insufficient when life itself is at stake. The hospital itself shifted slowly. Administrator adjusted policies under the gaze of oversight. Doors, once barriers, became portals. Procedures, once rigid, began to integrate discretion, nuance, and accountability. Staff were retrained, protocols rewritten, communication channels clarified. Changes were subtle, invisible to the casual observer, yet foundational. The building itself had learned, through human cost, to acknowledge vulnerability as part of its operating system. The neon light above the lobby glowed as if aware, a witness to both failure and remediation, a sentinel of consequence now imbued with awareness. Months later, the mother returned. She arrived in silence, alone, pushing a new wheelchair, her son absent only because the shadow of loss still lingered in memory. The doors opened automatically after midnight, a simple mechanical gesture now imbued with symbolic weight. She paused at the threshold, hand resting on the smooth frame, feeling the hum of the building beneath her fingers. There was no triumph in her eyes, no victorious glare at the institution that had once withheld life. Only quiet reflection, a measured recognition of the balance finally restored. Justice, she realized, had not been victorious, it had been redistributed, a rebalancing of weight that had once crushed her alone. Inside, hospital staff moved past her with calm efficiency. The guard was gone. Supervisors monitored compliance with a new vigilance. EMTs were trained to respond without hesitation. Anti-bias protocols were visible on screens, woven into every shift, every assignment, every intake. The mother's presence was no longer an emergency. It was a reminder, a subtle human proof that the system could learn, could respond, could be reshaped by consequence. She let the wheelchair roll forward, the wheels humming softly against polished tile. Light fractured across the floor in the same fractured neon she had seen months ago, yet now it felt different. It reflected not helplessness, but possibility. Not negligence, but awareness. Not inaction, but accountability. The threshold had been crossed again, this time by intention, by design, by reflection. The building itself seemed to breathe in the quiet, doors opening, policies shifting, oversight watching. Silence was no longer passive. It was observed. In her mind, she replayed that night. The rain, the fluorescent hum, the guard's hesitation, her son's fragile frame. The trauma did not fade, it could not, but the system had been forced to recognize consequence. The weight of responsibility, once ignored, had been redistributed across personnel, policy, and oversight. The mother understood that life could not always be restored, but lessons could be codified. Procedures could become responsive. Systems could be held accountable. Justice, she reflected, was not a shout of victory, but the quiet acknowledgement of equilibrium restored, imperfect but necessary. The lobby's lights flickered in the early morning, long shadows stretching across tile. The mother paused, hands on the wheelchair, looking up at the cameras that now silently documented without judgment. She let herself breathe. One measured inhale, then another. The building exhaled too, a silent witness to the past, a vigilant guardian of the present. Justice, finally, was procedural and human intertwined. It was monetary, yes, but more than that, it was moral, structural, observed, and enduring. A life lost had prompted learning. Tragedy had reshaped architecture, authority, and accountability. The guard, once emblematic of rigid enforcement, had vanished from view, replaced by personnel trained in discretion. The doors, once barriers, now moved with human urgency in mind. The lobby, once a theater of delay, now existed as a calibrated space, watching, responsive, awake. And in that quiet, cinematic threshold, the story closed where it had begun. Rain-slicked streets outside reflected neon shards. Fluorescent within echoed across polished floors. And the mother pressed forward, moving across a space that now acknowledged consequence. No triumph. No dramatized victory. Only measured recognition. Only justice tempered by reflection. Only silence observed. The building finally had learned to see.